Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar about how to write or how to use Excel custom functions with Python and Azure Functions. So first things first, I guess nowadays I have to start with a little disclaimer. That is, this webinar is not about Microsoft's brand new official Python and Excel solution. This is about Excel Wings, mostly because Python and Excel is sort of a completely different product and doesn't offer the capabilities of what I'm going to walk you through today. So today, after a short introduction, I'm going to go through the basics of the custom functions before then looking at a little bit more elaborate samples, including pandas and database access. And then we're sort of going into more the professional developer cycle. So we're going to see like how we can deploy new updates to your functions via GitHub Actions. We're going to have a look into logging, how that works on Azure Functions. And very important in an enterprise context, we're going to see how we can leverage the single sign-on identity of the logged-in user in Excel and also use that in connection with Azure AD to provide role-based access control. Now, I basically created Excel Wings almost 10 years ago, almost 10 years before Microsoft got into this market. And likewise, I published with O'Reilly the book about Python for Excel, which isn't just about Excel Wings, but also about giving you an introduction to, Python pandas and all the other Python Excel libraries such as OpenPyXL. So that also has been a couple of years. And maybe, who knows, there's going to be a second edition that will include the Microsoft solution, but definitely not tomorrow. So other than Excel Wings, I also work on a SaaS product called Excel Trail. It allows you to diff or compare Excel workbooks so you can actually see what changed. So it's a bit of a better version control than what Office 365 offers you. It does so for VBA code, it does so for Power Query code, and you can definitely give it a try if you have issues on the side of version control. It's basically GitHub for Excel workbooks. I do regularly tweet or post on LinkedIn, and I do more seldomly also upload videos on the Excel Wings channel on YouTube. So if you like to hear about the stuff we talk about today, then definitely make sure to follow me on these channels. And so, let's dive into custom functions and how they work with Excel Wings. So first of all, they are compatible with Windows, macOS, and Excel Online. So that's pretty cool. They sort of like work everywhere where Excel runs. The trick to make that work is to leverage the Office.js add-ins. So these are the modern web-based add-ins that get deployed through the official Excel add-in store. We're going to have a look how that works. And Python, for that matter, runs on a self-hosted server. You could obviously also run it locally as a local host on localhost. But yeah, as the title said from this webinar, we're going to use Azure Functions. And well, just because it is a popular solution, but it's one of a gazillion of other solutions. So like if you're an AWS shop, you may prefer to use AWS Lambda, and it works absolutely the same. On the side of Excel, you will need to have either a recent version of Microsoft 365, the subscription model, or then if you use the one-off purchases or the permanent licenses, you would need to have Office 2021, so the very latest Office, because custom functions on the side of Office.js has been introduced only in 2018, so Office 2021 is the first permanent license Office to support that. I'll be following or using a demo repository. It's on GitHub. It's open source. I'm going to use the auth branch there, so you can have a look at this in more detail after the show here. Now, to get you back on sort of like, a better understanding how this thing works, it's using XL-Wing Server together with Office.js add-ins, as I sort of mentioned before. So now in detail, that means XL-Wing Server just means you're self-hosting a web app using your favorite framework. So that could be Django Flask Fast API, and you are hosting it wherever you want. As I said, we're going to use Azure Functions in this webinar, but you can use it. You can host it on your internally hosted Kubernetes cluster if that's your thing. Now, on the side of the add-in, that's just an XML file. That XML file can be served from the same server, but you can also just upload it from your local disk into the add-in store. And as I said, we're going to have a look in a minute how this looks like from an end user perspective. And before we get started here on the demo, I guess a pretty important remark here is that this webinar is very high level. So I'm going to show you more or less how things look, how they behave, what's possible. But for the details, you'd have to then probably have a second look at the repository sample code and at the docs of XL-Wings, where everything is explained in more detail. So again, idea here is to show you what's possible and not to give you sort of a step-by-step tutorial today. All right, and that's yeah, I guess time to dive into the demo. So these are more sort of like talking points to make sure I don't forget any of the things I wanted to show you today. So yeah, about the add-in. How are people getting access to your add-in? Let me find my prepared Office admin view here in the browser. So as you can see, the Office Administration Center offers the administrator to upload custom apps. And so you can say Office add-in, and then as I said, you can basically point it to a URL, or you can just upload it from the local XML file. The local XML file, if you look here at the source code on GitHub, that would be the manifest Azure Functions, in this case, .xml. So upload this XML file here, and that will then automatically make this add-in available to all the target users. So like it offers you basically a way to just deploy it to like a single user or maybe a group of users. So you're pretty flexible in who should get access to your add-in. And then when you or the users open up Excel, they will already have the add-in installed. So that's pretty cool, and it's a pretty big step forward compared to the old world with the VBA add-ins, where yeah, it was a pretty big nightmare to have them installed on every user's machine. And so in this case, it will actually place a single button here on the home tab here, so you can use existing tabs. You don't necessarily have to create a new one. And this is going to be simple. So today we're going to focus on really just custom functions, or user-defined functions as they were called in the past. And we're not going to do anything fancy with buttons and macros. That's for another webinar. So in that case, we don't have to do anything here on this side pane. It's just nice. You can give instructions to users. You can give them links to external documentation. But in our case, we don't really use it. So we can definitely close it. And then we can just start using the functions that we are going to have a look into in just a moment, and start using that that user-defined functions. And so this is, as I said, an Azure Functions, which means that the very first call, if you don't keep the runtime running all the time, the very first call will have a delay because it has to start the runtime on the server side. But then subsequent calls, once the Azure functions have scaled to to be able to respond to the load, that is really very quick. And so at this point, let's have a quick look at the repository and basically the function definition that we have been using here. So let's make that a tiny little bit bigger here on the side of Excel maybe. And then, yeah, this is the function that we were using. So if you have used XLWings before, if you maybe use the local version that runs on Windows only, then the only difference in that case is that instead of doing xlwings.func or importing func decorated directly from XLWings, you would be importing it from the server subpackage. So like xlwings.server.func. And so that just makes clear that this function will run on the server. And then we can do, obviously, so that's the hello world. We can do some more fun stuff. So for example, here we have a NumPy sample. So I could do this guy here with random pseudo-random numbers, and then I could use for example, like a correlation function from pandas. So I can just use this one here, then do that and a hash, so to get the full area of the dynamic array. Click enter, and that's pretty much it. So like now, every time I recalculate, I'll get, the functions to update according to the new random numbers. So that's just super helpful to have all this functionality from pandas, NumPy, and just all the other things that Python gives me. They integrate perfectly with the dynamic arrays that have been around for a couple of years now. So that is a very intuitive way of like linking up the two worlds. Now, another way of how you can, use this is to basically create a database query. That's also often, a thing. So in that case, what I've done is I've deployed externally a Postgres database that hosts the AdventureWorks sample database. And from there, I'm basically just querying the person data, and I'm giving it a limit over here. And as you can see, it returns that, by the way, the database isn't even hosted on Azure. It's on basically on AWS, and it's still absolutely fast enough to serve my user-defined function. You can also see that dates, unlike in the old user-defined function world, they are automatically converted to a proper date in the Excel world. So that's pretty cool. You can obviously then maybe have another one over here, and then you could go into your database, maybe do some changes. So Ken turns into Ken2, and then do a refresh here, and then you will get your Ken2 all over the place. So that's pretty nice integration also with databases. All right, so I guess at this point, I'd like to go back and see what I need to talk about. So probably I should talk about how to deploy the code to Azure Functions. And if you have a look at the repository over here, then in the README, it basically explains how you can do this manually from your local laptop. You would need, to have the Azure CLI installed, and then issue a couple of commands so that it generates all the required resources on Azure Functions. And last, then you run this Azure Function app publish command, which you also will or can run locally to deploy an update of your code. So like if you change this here into a different function, then you would have to run this this command down here, and a few moments later you have this live. However, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a continuous integration approach, which means I'm just going to deploy this. I'm just going to commit and push this to GitHub, and then from there, GitHub Actions will automatically or take care of deploying the solution. So I'll say updated hello function. I will commit and push. And once it's done, I can actually look into the GitHub Actions pipeline over here. If you have the GitHub Actions extension here in VS Code, you can actually look at it locally. But you can obviously also click here on the GitHub Actions link and then get into the repository directly into the pipeline. This is going to take a moment, so we're just going to leave that deploying, and we'll get back to it in a minute or two once it's done. So in the meantime, we can have a look into the Azure Functions. And so basically, when you go into your Azure portal, you will go to the Functions app. You will see my deployed XLWings Quick Start function here, and you will have the different endpoints that XLWings needs, and which are deployed basically by the boilerplate code here under the function app. You will see them running over here. So what I'm using here, it's a couple of endpoints that are required to run XLWings on the server. You can use it with any Python framework. So what I'm using here is really the raw native Azure Functions framework, but Azure Functions actually also allows you to use a WSGI or ASCII framework, which means you can use Flask or you can use Fast API. Probably recommendable, but I wanted to stay sort of like, as close to the raw Azure function setup. So I was just sticking to that. So so whenever a function is called, it is going to hit this endpoint here. And as you can see, to log that, to use login in Azure Functions, you would use basically the root logger. So you just have to do logging.info, and then that here gets logged. And so to see how this looks like, you would go to custom functions call down here, and then you can navigate to monitor, and you will get all the successful and unsuccessful runs of your function over here. Bear in mind, it takes a minute or two. It's actually very slow to update it. So it's not like pushing it in real time. So you need to be a bit patient. In our case, as you can see here, this is the log message that we've just looked at in the code. And then I've got some other log messages here. And so as you can see, it logs my username and basically my email that I use from the logged in user. And it also tells me that I have the XLWings user role. We will get into all that in just a little bit. But in the meantime, maybe we can have a look. The code, the update has been deployed. We can have a look. We can go back in here and basically just, rerun that function. And if we're lucky, it gives me the by XLWings. And so, yeah, the deployment has been done successfully, and everybody who uses the add-in will automatically get the latest custom function to work in their spreadsheet. So like all the, complexity around pushing updated code to end users, pushing them an updated add-in are practically gone. You have a professional developer workflow. You push to GitHub, it automatically deploys. If you want to be an even better the developer, then it runs some unit tests before it allows you to deploy to production. But we're not going to look into that today. So let me see where we are in terms of features that I wanted to show you. So we've done all that. Now that brings us, to sort of like the next 2 points. So user authentication via single sign-on and RBAC, which is role-based access control. Now, as you've already seen in the logs before, we do have access to, if I find it again, we do have access to the user's ID. Now, the way that this works is that if we have a quick look at the code is we have an auth module here, and the auth module takes the JWT token that the Office.js add-in sends over and basically verifies that it is, properly signed, and then reads out the identity that is contained in that token. And so that's how it allows me to verify the user, the one who is logged in here. We're going to have a look at the very end, what happens when I sign out. So this is a very, very, very strong capability of these Office.js based add-ins, that you are able to securely identify the user on the back end. On the front end, which is basically the add-in itself, or the task pane HTML, you have this get auth function. Again, it's basically boilerplate, and it just requests that token from Office.js and sends it over with every request for our backend to verify. Right, so let me see. So that is authentication. Yeah, 2 more comments about that. The first one is you do not need to run your code on Azure or Azure Functions, your backend, to be able to use that identity. You can verify that on every backend you like. That's completely vendor independent. There's different methodologies you can use, but as you can see, it's literally below, it's like 50 lines of code to verify that access token, and that's vendor independent. The other thing I wanted to mention is that probably, what else do I want to mention? Yeah, I guess that you can use it with, any provider. Maybe there's something else I wanted to mention. I'll get back to that in a minute. All right, so that's the identity. So basically, like, if you're not logged in, you can lock down your authentication module to not allow you to run that code. But what's also important is that you may have a case, let's say, the database access, where you will have differences in people's roles. So you can say an administrator or like a database writer can push data to the database, but then maybe a normal user can only read from the database. So you need to assign roles and rights to those users. And also this part you can do very easily together with Azure AD. So in Azure AD, and that's basically like when you go into, again, the Azure portal, and again, this doesn't mean you have to deploy your backend to Azure Functions. It will work with any other backend also. So you can go to Azure Active Directory, and then you'd have, for example, your app registration, where you have this application registered. And then, for example, here under Enterprise Applications, you can define roles and then assign those roles to users. And so as you can see, me here, I do have assigned the XLWings user role. It's what we saw before here in the in my user log. So yeah, I am the one who comes with the XLWings user rights. Now, what happens if we require the user to have more rights and not just the XLWings user rights? So I can go into the application over here under the configuration. And by the way, this is where we have also stored the database connection string in a secure manner. So that's one of the big advantages you have in this setup. These sensitive, tokens and credentials, they are being stored on the server. They are, properly encrypted. They will never touch your end user's computer. And so basically here, I do have an environment variable that defines the required roles. So as you can see, it is XLWings users now. And if I change that to also, let's say, XLWings writer, and OK, save and continue, then it'll restart the app. And we will be able to see what that produces here on the front end. So like, if I run that, as you can see, I get an error value now. And if you hover over that, they couldn't have possibly made this more subtle, but it works at least. So if you hover over that error message, you will get a detailed reason for what's happening. And so if you can read that, it says auth error, required roles missing, XLWings writer. So that's how like, you can request different roles. It would have been obviously a tiny little bit more intuitive if I would have, let's say, taken away the XLWings user role from my user here on Azure AD. The problem with that is that these user roles take about 10 to 15 minutes to be propagated. And so it's very hard to show that in a live demo. Whereas just, adding an environment variable restarts the application instantly and thus, allows me to show you the error message right away. All right, so we're back to only requiring the user right. XLWings user right, and that means that we should now get the function working again. Okay, and so that sort of like almost brings us to the end of the demo. So what I want to show you as the very last step is what happens if we sign out. So like if I sign out here, and if I do that, then it should actually, it will log you out. The problem is that the token also has basically the, it's valid for about an hour. So you would have to wait an hour until this logs you out, and then it'll actually pop up the login form for you to log in. The reason why I can show you this is that as soon as I'm logged out, as I'm using the deployed version, it also takes away the add-in in here, so I can't now reload the add-in. So yeah, for one more hour, you'll be able to use that, and then it'll be logged out. All right, so that's been sort of like a whirlwind tour through the capability and more sort of like professional developer and enterprise features that you can use. Going forward, to sort of like conclude this webinar, you have as a roadmap, what's on the horizon is streaming functions. So you can, for example, push, prices, live prices in real time to the Excel cell. And then also object handles, which is pretty much what Microsoft is doing in their version of Excel in Python, so that instead of like having to write out, let's say, a data frame as in its entirety into the Excel cells, you just get sort of like an object handle in a single cell and then can use it further in subsequent functions. So that's sort of like the way forward. And yeah, at this point, I would like to say thank you for joining. Thanks for being interested in Excel Wings, and I'm happy to get all the questions on the chat. And see you hopefully next time in the next webinar. Thanks. Bye bye.